Hello everyone, Mark Heck coming to you from the Cowichan Indian Reservation on Vancouver Island, a place where slavery used to be very, very common. And there's a question about slavery that has come up lately, and that is, why did slavery come to an end here? Now, if you think about it, down in the United States, there was a civil war involving the question of slavery. But here on the West Coast, there wasn't a civil war, there wasn't a loud debate, there weren't any criminal prosecutions or anything like that. Slavery just kind of came to a slow rolling end all on its own. Now, in the past, historians thought it ended because the British colonial government put a stop to it. But it turns out that argument doesn't really fit the evidence. There's actually a better explanation for why slavery among the Indigenous people on the west coast of Canada came to an end. I'll explain what actually happened, but before I do, if you're looking for some unusual and novel takes on Canada's history and future, make sure to subscribe. Okay, so why did slavery actually come to an end on the west coast? And we know that slavery was common. It wasn't practiced by every single group, and not all were at the same level of intensity, but it was definitely practiced. Of that, there's no doubt. Now, some groups, such as the Cowichan, where I am right now, were so involved in it that 30% of their entire population consisted of slaves. But why? Why slavery? Why here? We have to look at slavery as a business. And like any business, if the economics are good, all other factors being equal, it's going to exist. So wherever you find slavery around the world, it's almost always got the same underlying condition. So first, the economy is reliant on a product with low value but high labor needs. For example, think about something like cotton. Harvesting cotton, pre-mechanization of course, required a lot of manual labor. It also requires manual dexterity to get the cotton off the plants in the fields. You know, it's got sharp barbs, so you gotta be careful. But what really matters is that after picking cotton all day, you end up with a big pile of white, fluffy stuff that really isn't worth a whole lot. In other words, you need a lot of raw cotton to make any sort of profit. And so, of course, as a cotton plantation owner, you need a lot of really cheap labor. And second, the activity is tedious and repetitive. Third, it doesn't require a lot of skill. Picking cotton, that doesn't require a lot of skill. Diamond cutting, now that requires a lot of skill and the end product has really high value. So diamond cutting, that'll never be done by slaves. Digging diamonds out of the ground, on the other hand, yeah, that could be done by slaves for sure. Okay, but the fourth factor is that it's physically uncomfortable. It's gross, smelly, hot, sticky, disgusting. Something you have to essentially force people to do. When you look at those factors combined, there will always be things that are prone to slavery, we could say. So some big ones, cotton, sugar, fish. Slavery in the American South, for example, was mostly connected to cotton. Slavery in the Caribbean was mostly connected to sugarcane, and slavery on the West Coast was connected to the processing of large volumes of fish. And, well, of course, fish are smelly. Processing requires tedious work, but not much skill. It's repetitive, and the product is low value where there's lots of it. Now, if Europeans arrived on the West Coast in the late 1700s and found that slavery didn't exist, that would actually be really weird. It'd be super unusual. It just wouldn't fit any known economic model of activity. But since the indigenous people here weren't morally exceptional in any way, and they had a lot of fish, they had slavery. Totally expected. It just made economic sense for them to go out and capture slaves from neighboring groups, mostly women and children, so they could process all the fish they would catch and eat. And that went on for thousands of years until Europeans showed up in the late 1700s. So British captain James Cook famously sailed into Nootka Sound in 1778 and met the famous Chief Mackina of the New Channel. Being diplomatic and good at business, both Captain Cook and Chief Mackina personally hit it off, and they ended up engaging in this sort of beneficial trade and had friendly relations for many years. Now, it should be pointed out here that a number of Spanish and American ships and their captains were not so skilled in diplomacy and consequently were either murdered by Chief Mackina or chased off by the chief and his warriors. So Captain Cook's tact and skill and we could even say gentlemanliness, was one of the greatest reasons this piece of the continent became British, not American. Okay, but I've gone off tangent. The thing is, both Captain Cook and Chief Mackina were well acquainted with slavery at the time. Both of their societies engaged in it. The difference is that 50 years later, the British stopped. They enacted the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. So the British stopped their own slavery and then outlawed it throughout the entire British Empire, which included the whole Pacific Northwest at the time. The big question is, did the British ban on slavery result in the end of slavery among the indigenous people on the West Coast as well? Now, some people, especially on the right, like to say, yes, it was the benevolent laws and actions of the British that put an end to slavery here. The real answer is, nope, that's not what happened. The indigenous people actually carried on with their slavery, and it only came to an end rather slowly for reasons that had nothing to do with the British rule of law. So why did the British not put a stop to slavery here? Well, it has to be understood that the British simply did not have the power to impose their morality and laws on all the indigenous nations up and down the West Coast at the time. They controlled, in the absolute sense of that word, only a tiny area around Victoria, Fort Victoria, where the Royal Navy was stationed. But the British Columbia coast is 26,000 kilometers long and scattered with infinite numbers of islands, fjords, inlets, and other impossible to reach places. The Royal Navy did sail up and down the coast and give a show of force every now and then to illustrate who was theoretically in control. But the reality was they didn't have supremacy of force in any meaningful way. And even on land, they had only 150 Royal Engineers that could dispatch to some far-flung places at, of course, great cost, time, and effort. But this was not even until 1858. So even when the 150 soldiers came from England, they were not at all capable of governing with any sort of truly compelling force. In the vast, rugged terrain of British Columbia, which is almost the size of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined, 150 guys is not going to be enough to force the locals to do anything. So what the British did bring instead, it was in some ways actually superior to military force. They brought business opportunity. They traded with the indigenous people through the Hudson's Bay Company, mostly furs. And we could think of the whole situation as the HBC being the business outlet. The Royal Navy was like the local coastal police detachment, and the Royal Engineers were the road builders and the inland police detachment. So in other words, the British had a mostly friendly business relationship with the indigenous peoples. And as long as trade and business relationships were on good terms, the British had some powers of moral persuasion, but they were in no position to forcefully suppress the slave trade, assuming they actually wanted to. And realistically, they weren't about to go around and tell their business partners that they had to stop engaging in slavery or face the long arm of the law. Now, it didn't mean the British didn't find slavery to be amoral. Governor James Douglas often spoke of his opinions on the vulgarity of slavery, as did many of his other officials. The problem was they just couldn't really do anything more than scold the slave traders and maybe a chief every now and then, which they did sometimes do. But they were in no position to forcefully end slavery among indigenous peoples on the West Coast. In fact, Europeans were sometimes victims of the slave trade themselves. There's a famous early account of a man named John Jewett who was taken by Chief Mackina himself after Mackina killed the captain and crew of the American trader ship, the Boston, leaving only Jewett and another fellow alive. Now, there were some later accounts of kidnappings for ransom as well. This kind of stuff was, it's not new. But the fact is, British Columbia did not get rid of slavery just because the British happened to outlaw it. I should add that this is different than what happened down in Washington and Oregon in 1846. They had very different priorities and powers down there. So they had the power of the U.S. Army behind them. And whenever the U.S. made treaties with indigenous peoples, they always included and enforced an anti-slavery clause. Now, unlike the British, the Americans were not in the business of trading with the natives. They were in the business of conquering them and then imposing their moral values upon them. So in the US, there was very different actions, different reasons, and different outcomes. But slavery on the west coast of British Columbia continued on throughout the whole 19th century, and some believe maybe even into the 20th century. So why did it come to an end if it wasn't the British putting an end to it? And the simple answer is the economics changed. There was a fabulous undergraduate paper written recently by a bright young student at the University of Victoria named Connor White, who talks about this at length. And his paper, partially titled The End of Slavery in British Columbia, 1830 to 1890, argued that slavery among the West Coast First Nations came to an end due to economics and social influences. And he argued his points very well, I might add. So I give a big shout out to this bright young man. It's always nice to see a well-researched and well-argued paper these days coming out of academia. And much of what I'm talking about here actually comes from him. Okay, so what actually happened? Why did slavery eventually come to an end on the west coast of British Columbia? Well, the indigenous people ran into a labor shortage problem, which came about from the deadly disease known as smallpox. You see, smallpox first appeared in the 1780s when Europeans began to show up. And it's kind of uncertain what effect this initial epidemic had on the population. But we know that in 1836, smallpox returned for a second time. And this time around, 30% of British Columbia's indigenous population died off. Now, when you have that kind of loss in any population, it's going to affect the economy, which it definitely did. The problem was that prior to population collapse, if you were an indigenous tribe on the West Coast and you needed slaves to, process the enormous amounts of fish that were regularly caught, all you needed to do was go up and down the coast in canoes and kidnap some of your neighbors and then turn them into slaves. And when there was a large, healthy population, there was always someone to steal. There was always plenty of people to kidnap, as it were. But with a population crash of a third, there was a sudden shortage of potential slaves. Okay, but if you run out of slaves, you got the question of, well, who's going to do all the dirty work? Because your society's going to start to fall apart when there aren't enough people to even do the most basic jobs just to keep everything together. So how do you fix a sudden labor shortage problem? I mean, they couldn't just say, hey, we'll build robots to replace our slaves. And they couldn't just import millions of low-skilled immigrants like we do today. So what did they do? Well, one of the most common things they did was give the surviving slaves more rights and freedoms, and then elevated them into higher rungs on the social ladder so they could actually fill some of those empty roles that were really needed to keep the society going, which actually made the labor shortage problem even worse at the lower levels. Now regular people had to do the actual work of processing fish themselves, so that you could say in some ways society actually became more equal for a while among some First Nations. Okay, but theoretically, what's going to happen in the long run? And the obvious answer is that population would recover over time, of course, and then things could get back to normal, right? Like you get back to the good old days of having large populations and just stealing from your neighbors and owning lots of slaves, and everything's good. With a large population, your biggest problem was actually ending up with too many slaves. I mean, if you have too many, maybe some are getting old and unproductive or just not willing to do anything, and nobody wants to buy them or trade them from you. So you've got an oversupply problem. So you have to get rid of some of them. And sometimes that just meant clubbing them with a big wooden cudgel, which would do the trick. Of course, ritualistic killings are probably a better option because then you get to show off your power. So a large population had its own problems too. And as I said, the population should have theoretically recovered and gotten back to those good old days of slavings and killings and so on. But that's not what actually happened. There were a couple other factors that made it really tough for the slave owners. Before Europeans arrived, if you were a slave, you were pretty much pooped. Your own group was unlikely to come rescue you. And if you were a really valuable person, well, maybe, but otherwise, once you were kidnapped, you were as good as gone. Your only option as a slave was to try to run away. But assuming you managed to get out of your captor's territory, you would almost always have to go through somebody else's territory. And well, guess what? They're just going to capture you and turn you into their slave. So there was not much point for a slave to try to escape prior to European arrival. But when the Europeans did show up, slaves started to realize they suddenly had some options. You see, it became known that if they could escape and get to a Royal Navy ship, the British would actually protect them. So that was good. And then missionaries began to set up mission stations and churches, many that still exist today, by the way, throughout British Columbia. And these too became known as safe havens for runaway slaves. For the slave owners, this kind of sucked because now it was hard to actually get their slaves to stay. And we sort of have a term for that today, ghosting the employer. Anyway, slaves could just run away, just leave and go to the safety of the British colonists. Now, I should mention there's evidence that slavery did actually increase for a short time with an influx of Europeans around about the mid-1800s. And the question is, well, why? Why there? Why then? And it's because if you're a strong, powerful indigenous man who can capture some young woman from a neighboring village and turn her into a prostitute for all those European men, especially the hordes of gold miners in the 1850s, well, that's a good way to make some money. Now, that's a business model as old as time itself. So that was happening mid-1800s. But again, a prostitute could often just run away from her owner, especially as even more Europeans showed up, set up more farms, and built more churches, which became the safe havens for runaway slaves and the forced prostitutes. So it appears that slavery did actually revive briefly in the mid-1800s as population rose back up again. But then something else happened. Smallpox hit again. So this third time in 1862, 1863, it's estimated around 60% of the indigenous population died off. Now the economics of slavery really didn't make any sense, and the whole practice went into decline quite rapidly after this. A Catholic missionary named Father Auguste Brabant, who spent some time among the New Channel a decade after this smallpox epidemic, reported that when he began his mission, slavery was still present, but by 1871 it had virtually disappeared. So in other words, it took less than 20 years for the entire slave economy to disappear, at least in this area. And that had more to do with economics than the law. Elsewhere, there's evidence slavery still carried on quite a bit longer until around the 1890s at least, and possibly even into the 20th century. And as long as it was economically viable or even prestigious and was in basically an isolated place, it continued. But overall, the trend was downward. And what we know today is that in the end, slavery on the west coast of British Columbia, it didn't come to an end because the British mandated it. It came to an end because it was no longer economically viable. And in fact, in a great twist of irony, we could say that it was the introduction of European disease that most helped set the slaves free. And perhaps it's a bit of an impropriety to say this, but the indigenous people today who came from slave origins, maybe they should really be thanking the Europeans for helping set them free, not by law, but through the unintended benefits of smallpox. You're welcome.